The water was perfect that Saturday afternoon, crystal clear and inviting under the July sun at Millbrook Lake. Maya Rodriguez adjusted her red bikini straps and grinned at her best friend Sarah, who was already waist-deep in the cool water. "Come on, Maya. It's amazing," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the small beach, where families had set up colorful umbrellas and children built sand castles. Maya waded in slowly, savoring the contrast between the warm sand beneath her feet and the refreshing lake water. At 17, she was an accomplished swimmer, captain of her high school team. With college scholarship offers already coming in, the water had always been her sanctuary, her place of peace. "Race you to the floating dock," Maya challenged, pointing to the wooden platform anchored about 200 yards from shore. "You're on." Ara laughed, but Maya was already diving forward, her strokes cutting through the water with practiced precision. The lake stretched out before them, surrounded by dense pine forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place families came to escape the city heat, where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Maya pulled ahead easily, her competitive spirit kicking in as she approached the halfway mark. That's when she felt a sharp, searing pain shooting up her right leg. "Ah!" she gasped, breaking her stroke and treading water. The pain was intense, like someone had driven a knife into her calf muscle. Cramp. A bad one. Maya tried to massage the muscle underwater, but the spasm only worsened. She'd experienced cramps before during training, but never this severe, never this debilitating. Her leg felt like it was on fire. "Sarah," she called out, trying to keep the panic from her voice. Her friend was still swimming toward the dock, unaware of Maya's distress. Maya attempted to swim with just her arms, but without the use of her right leg, she couldn't maintain her position. The lake, which had seemed so calm moments before, now felt vast and threatening. She slipped under the surface for a moment, swallowing water, then fought her way back up. "Help!" she screamed, louder this time. "Sarah." Sarah finally turned around, her face immediately shifting from playful to concerned when she saw Maya struggling. "Maya, what's wrong?" "Cramp. Bad cramp." Maya shouted back, her head dipping below the surface again. The pain in her leg was overwhelming, making it impossible to kick or even float properly. Sarah began swimming back toward her, but she was a much weaker swimmer than Maya, and the distance between them felt impossibly far. Maya could see the fear in her friend's eyes, the same fear that was now clawing at her own chest. On the shore, 5 police officers from the 47th Precinct had been enjoying their day off, grilling burgers and drinking beer at a picnic table near the water's edge. Officers Jake Morrison, Tony Castellanos, Mike Rodriguez, no relation to Maya, Danny Walsh, and Sergeant Rick Barnes had come to Millbrook Lake to blow off steam after a particularly brutal week on the job. "Do you hear that?" Morrison asked, pausing mid-bite of his burger. He was a 10-year veteran with graying temples and tired eyes that had seen too much. The group looked toward the water, where Maya's desperate calls for help were becoming more frantic. "Some kid's in trouble," Walsh observed, standing up from the picnic table. He was the youngest of the group at 26, still relatively new to the force. Maya's head disappeared under the water again, and when she surfaced, her movements were becoming increasingly erratic. The cramp had spread to her entire right side, and exhaustion was setting in fast. "Please, she screamed toward the shore, her voice breaking with terror. I can't swim." Sarah was still trying to reach her, but she was struggling too, clearly not strong enough to help in these conditions. Other beachgoers were starting to notice the commotion, pointing and murmuring among themselves. Sergeant Barnes, a 20-year veteran with a permanent scowl, barely glanced up from his beer. "Not our jurisdiction," he muttered. "We're off duty." "There's no lifeguard on duty either," Castellanos added, though his voice carried less certainty than Barnes'. At 34, he had 2 daughters of his own, and felt a stirring of unease, watching the scene unfold. Morrison stood up, shading his eyes to get a better look at the situation. Maya was clearly in serious distress now, her strokes becoming weaker and more desperate. Should we, what?" Barnes cut him off. "Risk our lives for some stupid kid who can't swim? Look around, plenty of other people here. Someone else can play hero." But no one else was moving. The other beachgoers seemed frozen, either unsure of their own swimming abilities or waiting for someone with authority to take action. Maya went under again, this time for longer. When she surfaced, she was clearly weakening. The cramp had her entire right side locked up, and panic was making it even harder to think clearly. "Dad's gonna kill me if I don't make it to dinner," she gasped to herself, trying to inject some normalcy into the moment. Her father, Captain Eduardo Rodriguez of the Internal Affairs Division, had been looking forward to their Saturday night tradition of making paella together. It was one of the few times her workaholic father truly relaxed. The thought of disappointing him gave her a surge of determination. She tried once more to swim toward shore, using only her left arm and leg, but made barely any progress. If anything, she seemed to be drifting further out. "Somebody help her," a woman on the beach finally shouted. "She's drowning." Walsh looked at his colleagues, conflict written across his young face. "Come on, guys. We took an oath to serve and protect. Our oath is to the city, not to every dumbass who gets in over their head at some lake," Barnes shot back. Besides, what if one of us gets hurt trying to save her? What if we both drown? Then what good are we to anyone? Maya's head went under again. This time she stayed down for what felt like an eternity before breaking the surface, coughing and sputtering. Her movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated. "I'm going in," Walsh announced, starting to remove his shirt. "No, you're not," Barnes ordered, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "That's a direct order. Walsh, we are not getting involved." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Sarge, maybe we should." "Should what?" "Risk our careers, our pensions, our families' security for one person." "Use your head, Morrison. We don't even know if she's really drowning or just being dramatic." But Maya wasn't being dramatic. The cramp had now spread to her left side as well, and her strength was failing rapidly. She could barely keep her head above water. Sarah had finally reached her, but quickly realized she wasn't strong enough to help. "I can't hold you up," she cried, her own strokes becoming panicked as Maya instinctively grabbed onto her. "Don't pull me down," Sarah screamed, trying to separate herself from Maya's desperate grip. The two girls struggled in the water, both now in danger as Maya's panic made her cling to Sarah like a drowning person clings to anything that floats. Mike Rodriguez, the officer who shared Maya's last name but had never met Hera finally, stood up. "This is fucked up," he said quietly. "That kid's really drowning." "Sit down, Rodriguez," Barnes commanded. "That's an order." But Rodriguez was already moving toward the water. "I don't care about orders right now. I'm not watching a kid die." Barnes grabbed his arm. "You take one more step toward that water, and I'll have you up on charges for insubordination. Your career will be over." Rodriguez froze, torn between his conscience and his livelihood. He had 2 kids at home and a mortgage. His wife was already nervous about his job. Getting fired would destroy their family. In the water, Maya was losing the battle. Her vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and lack of oxygen. She'd gone under 3 more times, each time staying down longer. "Daddy," she whispered during what would be her last moment at the surface, thinking of Captain Eduardo Rodriguez, who was at that very moment shopping for ingredients for their pajela dinner. "I'm sorry." Maya Rodriguez, 17 years old, honor student, swim team captain, and beloved daughter, slipped beneath the surface of Millbrook Lake for the final time at 3:47 p.m. on Saturday, July 13th. Sarah, exhausted and traumatized, barely made it back to shore with the help of 2 civilian swimmers who had finally overcome their own fears and jumped in. But they were too late for Maya. The 5 officers from the 47th Precinct sat in stunned silence as the reality of what they'd just witnessed and failed to prevent settled over them. "Jesus Christ," Walsh whispered, his face pale. "What did we just do?" Barna's jaw was tight, but his voice remained steady. "We did our job. We protected ourselves and followed protocol. End of story." But it wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. As the paramedics and rescue divers arrived to recover Maya's body, none of the 5 officers thought to ask the girl's name. They didn't stick around for the inevitable questions and interviews. They packed up their picnic and left, each man dealing with the weight of their decision in his own way. Morrison drove home in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Castellanos called his wife and told his daughters he loved them. Walsh submitted his resignation letter that night, unable to reconcile what he'd witnessed with the oath he'd taken. Rodriguez drank himself to sleep, haunted by the image of a girl who shared his name disappearing beneath the water. And Sergeant Rick Barnes. He convinced himself that they'd made the right call, that self-preservation was the most important thing, that one leaf. Captain Eduardo Rodriguez had been standing in the produce section of Martinez Market, carefully selecting tomatoes for sofrito when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Saturday evenings were sacred, reserved for cooking with Maya and catching up on her week, but the caller ID showed the county coroner's office. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Deputy Coroner Jennifer Walsh. I'm calling about your daughter, Maja Elena Rodriguez." The bag of saffron slipped from his fingers, scattering golden threads across the linoleum floor like scattered dreams. Now, 48 hours later, Eduardo sat in his Crown Victoria outside the 47th Precinct, staring at the brick building where he'd spent the last 36 hours methodically destroying 5 lives. The manila folder on his passenger seat contained everything: witness statements, timeline reconstructions, background checks, and most damning of all, cell phone footage from a teenager who'd been recording TikTok videos when Maya died. The video was grainy but clear enough. 5 men in shorts and polo shirts, sitting at a picnic table while a girl screamed for help in the background. One of them, the oldest, clearly giving orders. Another starting to move toward the water before being physically restrained. Eduardo had watched it 47 times. He checked his watch. 7:15 a.m. The morning shift would be arriving soon. Perfect timing. The glass doors of the precinct slid open with a soft whoosh as Eduardo entered, his footsteps echoing in the marble lobby. Sergeant Patricia Hendricks looked up from the front desk, her routine smile faltering when she saw his face. "Captain Rodriguez, we weren't expecting. Where's Captain Thompson?" Eduardo's voice was steady, professional. He'd perfected this tone over 20 years, an internal affairs calm surface, hiding the storm beneath. "He's in his office, but tell him I'm here. Official business." Hendricks reached for her phone, but Eduardo was already walking past her desk toward the elevator. He knew this building well. He'd investigated officers here before, but never like this. Never personal. Captain James Thompson was reading duty rosters when Eduardo appeared in his doorway. Thompson looked up with the wary expression every precinct commander wore when internal affairs came calling. Eduardo, wasn't expecting you today. Sorry again about your loss. By the way, Maya was cut the bullshit. Jim, Eduardo stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. We both know why I'm here. Thompson's face went carefully neutral. I'm not sure I follow. Eduardo placed the manila folder on Thompson's desk and opened it to reveal an 8x10 photograph of Maya in her swim team uniform, smiling at the camera with the confidence of a girl who believed the world was full of possibilities. My daughter died at Millbrook Lake on Saturday. 5 of your officers watched it happen. The color drained from Thompson's face. Eduardo. Don. Eduardo's voice remained level, but something in his eyes made Thompson lean back in his chair. Don't insult my intelligence or dishonor my daughter's memory with lies. I know Morrison, Castellanos, Rodriguez, Walson, Barnes were there. I know they saw her drowning, and I know they chose to do nothing. Thompson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. How could you possibly? Eduardo pulled out a tablet and pressed play on the TikTok video. The sound of Maya's desperate screams filled the small office, followed by a teenage girl's voice narrating, "Oh my God, there's like 5 cops over there, and they're not even trying to help her." The video showed the officers clearly, their faces visible as they deliberately turned away from the water where Maya was fighting for her life. Thompson watched in horror as the video captured Maya's final moments, her head disappearing beneath the surface, while 5 sworn officers of the law sat 30 yards away, finishing their lunch. Jesus Christ, Thompson whispered. Where are they? Eduardo asked. Eduardo, listen. Where are they? Thompson glanced at his computer screen. Morrison's on patrol in Sector 7. Castellanos is in court this morning, domestic violence case. Barnes is ... Barnes is right here. Night shift overtime. Eduardo smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Perfect. Eduardo, you can't whatever you're thinking, you can't do this alone. There are procedures, protocols, procedures. Eduardo's composure finally cracked, just slightly. Protocols. My 17-year-old daughter screamed for help while your officers sat there like it was dinner theater. She died. Jim, she died while they watched. Thompson stood up, his hands raised in a placating gesture. I understand you're grieving. Don't you dare patronize me. Eduardo's voice dropped to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. I've been doing this job since before you knew which end of a badge was up. I know exactly what I'm doing. He turned toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Jim, you might want to start thinking about early retirement. When this breaks, it will break here, going to need distance from the fallout. Eduardo left Thompson's office and walked straight to the break room, where he knew Barnes would be drinking coffee and reading the paper, blissfully unaware that his world was about to implode. Sergeant Rick Barnes was indeed at the corner table, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he worked on the crossword puzzle. At 52, he looked every day of his 25 years on the forced graying hair, thick around the middle, the permanent squint of a man who'd seen too much and cared too little. Barnes' sergeant looked up, mild annoyance crossing his features at being interrupted. Then he saw who had spoken. Eduardo Rodriguez stood in the doorway, and something about his posture, predatory coiled, made Barnes' coffee cup freeze, halfway to his lips. Captain Rodriguez? Didn't know you were visiting the 4-7 today. I'm not visiting. Eduardo walked into the break room, his footsteps deliberate. I'm investigating. Barnes set down his coffee cup carefully. Investigating what? Eduardo pulled out his phone and placed it on the table, then hit play on the video. Maya's voice filled the room, desperate and afraid. Help, please. I can't swim. Barnes went very still. Recognized the voice. Sergeant, I know. I don't know what her name was. Maya Rodriguez. Eduardo's voice was conversational now, almost friendly. 17 years old, honor student, swim team captain with a full scholarship to UCLA, waiting for her. Barnes' eyes darted toward the door, but Eduardo shifted slightly, blocking his path. Show was also my daughter. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Barnes felt his bowels turn to water. Sir, you, what? Barnes, you didn't know. You didn't recognize the name Rodriguez when you did absolutely nothing to save her life. Barnes' mouth worked soundlessly. Eduardo leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. I've spent the last 48 hours reconstructing Saturday afternoon, minute by minute. I know you were the ranking officer. I know Walsh tried to help and you physically restrained him. I know Morrison questioned your decision and you shut him down. I know you made the call, the conscious, deliberate call to let my child die. We were off duty, Barnes stammered. We didn't have jurisdiction. We couldn't risk. What? Eduardo's voice remained eerily calm. Your lives, your careers, your precious pensions? Barnes tried to stand, but Eduardo's hand slammed down on his shoulder, forcing him back into the chair. Let me tell you about risk, Sergeant. The risk of facing charges for dereliction of duty. The the risk of criminal negligence charges, the risk of having every case you've ever worked reviewed by my department, the risk of losing your pension, your benefits, your freedom. Eduardo straightened up and adjusted his tie. But mostly, the risk of having to explain to a grand jury why you watched a 17-year-old girl drown when you had the power to save her. Barnes was sweating now. Look, Captain, maybe we can work something out. Maybe there's a way to work something out. Eduardo's laugh was cold. You think this is a negotiation? He pulled out his phone again and dialed a number. Detective Martinez, it's Rodriguez. I need you to pick up Sergeant Rick Barnes from the 47th. Yes, now. Charges pending. Barnes lurched to his feet. You can't do this. You can't just, I'm internal affairs Barnes. I can do whatever the fuck I want. The break room door opened and 3 officers entered, not from the 47th, but from Eduardo's own department. They wore the serious expressions of people who'd seen the video, read the reports, and understood exactly what they were dealing with. Sergeant Barnes, Detective Martinez said formally, you're under arrest for criminal negligence resulting in death, dereliction of duty, and violation of your oath of office. As Barnes was cuffed and read his rights, Eduardo felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice, only the hollow ache of a father who would never again hear his daughter laugh. But this was just the beginning. Within an hour, patrol cars were dispatched to bring in Morrison and Castellanos. Rodriguez had already turned himself in after Walsh called to warn him. The only question was Walsh himself, the youngest, the one who'd tried to help, the one who'd submitted his resignation the night Maya died. Eduardo found him at home, sitting on his front porch with his head in his hands. Officer Walsh. Danny Walsh looked up with red-rimmed eyes. At 26, he looked like he'd aged a decade in 2 days. I've been waiting for you, Walsh said, quietly. Eduardo studied the young man's face. He saw genuine remorse there, real anguish. But he also saw Maya's face disappearing beneath the water while this man stood on T. 3 weeks after Maya's death, the courtroom was packed with reporters, fellow officers, and Maya's extended family. The preliminary hearing for the 4 defendants Barnes, Morrison, Castellanos, and Rodriguez had drawn national attention. Walsh, having cooperated fully with the investigation, was facing lesser charges and would be tried separately. District Attorney Rebecca Chen stood before Judge Harrison Martinez, holding the same manila folder Eduardo had carried into the 47th precinct. But now it contained much more than witness statements and cell phone video. Your Honor, Chen began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The evidence will show that these 4 defendants, all sworn peace officers, made a conscious decision to prioritize their own comfort over a human life. They watched Maya Rodriguez drown, and they did nothing. Defense attorney Marcus Webb, representing Barnes, rose to object. Your Honor, these men were off duty, under no legal obligation. Overruled, Judge Martinez said sharply. Ms. Chen, continue. Eduardo sat in the gallery, his eyes fixed on Barnes. The sergeant looked older than his 52 years, his face gaunt from stress and sleepless nights. Good, Eduardo thought. Let him suffer. Chen played the TikTok video on the courtroom's large screen. Even the third viewing made several people in the gallery gasp. Maya's voice, desperate and terrified, echoed through the solemn chamber. Please, somebody help me. What you're hearing, Chen explained, are the last words. Maya Rodriguez spoke loud enough for these defendants to hear. After this, she went under for the final time. The video showed Barnes clearly waving off Walsh when the younger officer moved toward the water. It showed Morrison standing up, then sitting back down at Barnes' command. It showed 5 men who could have saved life choosing instead to protect themselves. But Chen wasn't finished. She had spent 3 weeks building her case with the methodical precision of a surgeon, and Eduardo had provided her with everything she needed. Your Honor, we've also discovered that this wasn't the first time Sergeant Barnes made decisions that prioritized self-preservation over public service. Eduardo felt a grim satisfaction as Chen outlined Barnes' history. 3 excessive force complaints buried in his file. 2 incidents where he'd failed to respond to emergency calls during his lunch break, and a pattern of behavior that painted him as exactly what he was, a coward hiding behind a badge. Objection. Webb shouted. Prior acts are inadmissible, not when they establish a pattern of behavior. Counselor, Judge Martinez ruled. Overruled. Chen moved to Morrison next. Detective Jake Morrison, 10-year veteran, father of 2. He stood up when he saw Maya drowning. He questioned Sergeant Barnes' decision not to act. But when push came to shove, he chose his career over a child's life. Morrison's wife was crying softly in the gallery. Eduardo had no sympathy for her tears. His own wife had died of cancer 5 years ago, leaving him and Maya to build their lives together around Saturday night paella dinners and swim meets. Now, both women were gone, and Morrison's tears meant nothing. Officer Anthony Castellanos Chun continued, also has 2 daughters, ages 14 and 16. He watched a girl barely older than his own children struggle and drown, and he did nothing. Castellanos couldn't meet his wife's eyes. Eduardo knew from his investigation that the man's marriage was falling apart. His daughters weren't speaking to him. His 14-year-old had asked to live with her grandmother because she couldn't stand to look at her father. Officer Michael Rodriguez, Chen said, pausing for effect. He shares Maya's last name. When she was fighting for her life, he actually stood up to help. But when Sergeant Barnes grabbed his arm and threatened his career, he sat back down and watched her die. Eduardo had felt a particular fury toward this Rodriguez, not just because of the shared name, but because he'd come so close to doing the right thing. In Eduardo's mind, that made his failure even more damning. Webb stood for the defense. Your Honor, these are good men who made a difficult decision in a moment of crisis. They were off duty, at a recreational area, with no equipment for water rescue. Attempting to save someone in deep water without proper training could have resulted in multiple deaths. Then why didn't they call for help? Chen interrupted. Why didn't they alert the other beachgoers? Why didn't they do anything except watch? Webb faltered. Well, there were other people present who could have what? Mind read that police officers were choosing not to act. These defendants had authority, training, and most importantly, they had sworn an oath. They broke that oath when they let Maya Rodriguez die. Judge Martinez called for a recess. But Eduardo didn't move from his seat. He was remembering Maya's voice on the phone just that morning, Saturday morning, 3 weeks ago, asking if they could try a new recipe for the She'd found something online with chorizo and mussels. Of course, Mia, he'd said, not knowing it would be their last conversation. When court resumed, Chen played her ace. Your Honor, I'd like to call Captain Eduardo Rodriguez to the stand. Eduardo had been dreading this moment. Speaking publicly about Maya's death meant reliving it. But it also meant ensuring these men faced the full weight of their choices. He took the stand with the same composure he'd maintained throughout the investigation, professional, controlled, deadly. Captain Rodriguez, Chen began gently. Tell us about your daughter. Eduardo looked out at the courtroom, his eyes settling briefly on each defendant before speaking. Maya was 17. She was going to UCLA on a full swimming scholarship. She wanted to study marine biology because she loved the ocean. His voice remained steady, but his hands clenched slightly. She was a good kid. Honor student, never got in trouble. She called me every day after school to tell me about her classes. What was your relationship with your daughter? She was my best friend. The words came out quietly, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. After my wife died, it was just the two of us. We cooked together every Saturday night. We went to Dodgers games. She taught me how to use Instagram because she said I was too old to understand social media. A few people in the gallery smiled sadly at this. Eduardo continued, she was the best thing in my life, the only thing that mattered. Chen paused, letting that sink in. Captain, in your professional opinion, could these defendants have saved Maya's life? Eduardo looked directly at Barnes. Yes, any one of them could have saved her. They're all trained swimmers. It's part of police academy requirements. The water wasn't rough. She was maybe 200 yards from shore. A strong swimmer could have reached her in under 3 minutes. What would you have done in their situation? I would have gone in the water immediately. Eduardo's voice hardened. I would have done my job. Webb cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Eduardo as a grieving father seeking revenge, rather than justice. But Eduardo had spent 20 years in internal affairs. He knew how to handle hostile questioning. Captain Rodriguez, isn't it true that you've made it your personal mission to destroy these officers' lives? I've made it my mission to hold them accountable for their actions. You had them arrested within 48 hours of your daughter's death. Doesn't that seem like you were acting out of emotion rather than evidence? Eduardo smiled coldly. Counselor, I had 48 hours to watch cell phone video of 5 police officers ignoring their oath while my daughter drowned. Emotion would have been showing up at their homes with my service weapon. Evidence was what I brought to court. The courtroom fell silent. Webb had no response. Chen's closing argument was devastating. She replayed Maya's final moments, showed photos from the swim meets she'd never compete in again, read acceptance letters from colleges she'd never attend. Maya Rodriguez died alone in that water, abandoned by the very people who swore to protect her. These defendants had a choice. They chose themselves over service. They chose comfort over courage. They chose to let a child die. Webb's closing was weak, focused on technicalities and off-duty status. But everyone in the courtroom had seen the video. Everyone had heard Maya's voice calling for help, while 5 men did nothing. Judge Martinez didn't need long to deliberate. When he returned, his face was grave. The evidence in this case is overwhelming and, frankly, disturbing. These defendants, all sworn peace officers, witnessed a person in mortal danger and made a conscious decision to prioritize their own interests over human life. Eduardo held his breath. I find probable cause to bind all defendants over for trial on charges of criminal negligence resulting in death, dereliction of duty, and violation of oath of office. Bail is set at $50,000 each. The courtroom erupted. Barnes looked like he might vomit. Morrison was openly weeping. Castellano stared at his hands. Rodriguez just looked defeated. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, Eduardo felt something he hadn't experienced since Maya's death. Hope. Not for happiness that was gone forever, but for justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him with questions. Captain Rodriguez, How do you feel about today's ruling? Do you think justice was served? What would you say to other officers who might find themselves in similar situations? Eduardo stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd of cameras and microphones. When he spoke, his voice carried the 8 months after Maya Rodriguez drowned at Millbrook Lake, Captain Eduardo Rodriguez sat alone in courtroom 7, watching the jury file in for the final time. The trial had consumed his life, every waking moment dedicated to ensuring that the men who'd let his daughter die would face the full consequences of their choices. The media attention had been relentless. The Millbrook Five had become a national symbol of police indifference, sparking protests and calls for reform. The TikTok video had been viewed 47 million times. Maya's face was on murals across the city, her story told and retold, until it became something larger than the 17-year-old girl who just wanted to swim to a floating dock on a perfect Saturday afternoon. But Eduardo wasn't thinking about any of that as he watched Barnes, Morrison, Castellanos, and Rodriguez stand before Judge Martinez. He was thinking about the empty chair at his kitchen table where Maya used to sit while they planned their weekend adventures. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Martinez asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. Eduardo's hands clenched involuntarily. 8 months of investigation, testimony, expert witnesses, and emotional appeals had led to this moment. On the charge of criminal negligence resulting in death against Sergeant Richard Barnes, how do you find guilty? The word hit Eduardo like a physical blow, not of pain but of vindication. Barnes visibly sagged, his lawyer placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. On the charge of dereliction of duty against Sergeant Barnes, guilty. Violation of oath of office, guilty. The pattern continued for Morrison, Castellanos, and Rodriguez, guilty on all counts. 24 years of combined police service, reduced to a series of guilty verdicts that would send all 4 men to prison. Eduardo felt no joy, no satisfaction, only a hollow acknowledgement that the legal system had worked, that Maya's death had been validated as the tragedy it was. Judge Martinez scheduled sentencing for the following week, but Eduardo already knew what he would ask for in his victim impact statement: maximum sentences. No mercy for men who'd shown none to his daughter. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Chen found Eduardo sitting on a bench, staring at the traffic. "We got them," she said quietly. "Yeah." Eduardo's voice was flat. "We got them." Chen sat beside him. "You don't sound happy about it. Should I be?" Eduardo looked at her with eyes that had aged years in 8 months. 4 men are going to prison. Their families are destroyed. Their careers are over. And Maya is still dead. Eduardo, I know what you're going to say. That justice was served. That we sent a message. That other officers will think twice before making the same choice. Eduardo stood up, adjusting his tie with the same mechanical precision he'd maintained throughout the trial. Maybe you're right. Maybe this all means something. But as he walked away, Eduardo wasn't thinking about justice, or messages, or reform. He was thinking about Danny Walsh. Walsh had pled guilty to all charges 6 months ago, accepting a sentence of 2 years in prison and permanent disqualification from law enforcement. But before his sentencing, he'd asked to meet with Eduardo. They'd sat in a conference room at the DA's office. 2 men destroyed by the same 30 seconds at Millbrook Lake. "I dream about her every night," Walsh had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see her going under, and I see myself just standing there." Eduardo had expected to feel anger, satisfaction at the young man's obvious torment. Instead, he'd felt something uncomfortably close to pity. "I've started volunteering at the community center," Walsh continued. "Teaching kids to swim? I know it doesn't make up for anything, but why are you telling me this?" Eduardo had interrupted. Walsh looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Because I need you to know that she mattered, that her death changed me, that I think about her every single day and I always will." "Good," Eduardo had said. "You should." But now, 8 months later, Eduardo found himself thinking about Walsh more than the others. Walsh, who'd tried to help. Walsh, who'd resigned immediately. Walsh, who'd shown genuine remorse and was trying, in his broken way, to make amends. The others had shown no such grace. Barnes had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, insisting he'd made the right tactical decision. Morrison had blamed Barnes for his choices, claiming he was just following orders. Castellanos had hired the best lawyer his family could afford and tried to minimize his role. Rodriguez had remained silent, seemingly crushed by the weight of his failure but unwilling to acknowledge it publicly. Only Walsh had stood up in court and said the words that mattered. "I failed Maya Rodriguez. I failed my oath. I failed as a human being. I'm guilty, and I accept full responsibility for my actions." Eduardo drove home to the same empty house he'd lived in since Maya's death. He'd considered selling it to many memories. Too much silence, but couldn't bring himself to leave the place where he and Maya had been happiest. Her room remained exactly as she'd left it. Swim team trophies on the dresser. UCLA acceptance letter pinned to her bulletin board. A half-finished marine biology textbook on her nightstand because she'd wanted to get ahead before starting college. Eduardo sat on her bed and opened the photo album he'd been avoiding for months. Maya at age 5, missing her front teeth, but grinning at the camera. Maya at 10, holding up a first-place ribbon from her first swim meet. Maya at 16, rolling her eyes at his attempt to take a selfie. His phone rang. Detective Martinez. Eduardo, you need to see the news. Eduardo found the remote and turned on the television. A breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Millbrook Lake officer Danny Walsh found dead in prison cell. The reporter's voice seemed to come from very far away. Walsh, 27, was serving a 2-year sentence for his role in the drowning death of Maya Rodriguez. Prison officials say he was found hanging in his cell this morning. A suicide note was discovered. Eduardo turned off the television and sat in the silence of his daughter's room. Another life destroyed by 30 seconds of moral failure at a lake on a perfect Saturday afternoon. He thought about Walsh's wife, who'd stood by her husband throughout the trial, about Walsh's parents, who'd raised a son they thought was a good man, about the children Walsh had been teaching to swim, who would now learn that their instructor was gone. The ripples kept spreading. 3 days later, Eduardo attended Walsh's funeral. It was a small service most of Walsh's former colleagues couldn't bring themselves to attend, and the media attention had driven away casual acquaintances. But Eduardo felt compelled to be there, though he couldn't articulate why. Walsh's widow, Jennifer, was a small woman with kind eyes that now held the particular emptiness Eduardo recognized from his own mirror. Captain Rodriguez. She approached him after the service. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure either. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Jennifer spoke again. He talked about Maya every day, about what he should have done differently. I know he was trying to make amends. The swimming lessons, the community work, he knew it wouldn't bring her back, but he had to try. Eduardo nodded. He'd known about Walsh's volunteer work, had even gone to watch one of the lessons from his car. Seeing Walsh patiently teaching children to float, to kick, to trust the water instead of fear it, had complicated Eduardo's feelings in ways he wasn't ready to examine. Mrs. Walsh, Eduardo said carefully, your husband was the only one who tried to save Maya that day. He was stopped, but he tried. Jennifer Walsh's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't enough. No, Eduardo agreed, it wasn't enough. But it was something. As Eduardo drove home from the funeral, he found himself at a crossroads he hadn't expected. The legal system had worked. The guilty had been punished. Justice by any measurable standard had been served. But Danny Walsh was dead, and Maya was still gone, and Eduardo was left to wonder if the price of justice had been worth paying. That evening, he did something he hadn't done since Maya's death. He cooked paella, not because he was hungry, not because he enjoyed it, but because it was what she would have wanted. Maya had believed in moving forward, in finding meaning in tragedy, in using pain to create something better. As he stirred the saffron into the rice, Eduardo made a decision that would have surprised him 8 months earlier. He was going to establish a foundation in Maya's name, not for victims' rights or police reform, but for swimming lessons. Free lessons for kids who couldn't afford them, taught by volunteers who understood that every life in the water was precious. He was going to ask Jennifer Walsh to help him run it. The next morning, Eduardo returned to work for the first time since Maya's death. Internal affairs still needed him, still had cases that required his particular brand of methodical investigation. But now he understood something he'd never quite grasped before. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about prevention. It was about making sure other families didn't have to endure what he'd endured. His first case was a complaint against an officer who'd been slow to respond to a domestic violence call. Nothing criminal, just a pattern of complacency that needed addressing. Eduardo opened the file and began to read, thinking about Maya's voice on that TikTok video, calling for help that never came. He thought about Walsh, trying to teach children to swim because he couldn't save the one who mattered most. He thought about